Donald Trump seems dead set against that kind of solidarity emerging out of this. He just made a statement that was picked up. He was on a call with governors. You probably read about that. And he claims that Minnesota is a laughing stock for the George Floyd protests, and says governors will look like jerks if they don't dominate. How is that landing? People must be hearing that. How is that landing on the ground around you in Minneapolis? How are people taking those comments?
I think that Donald Trump looms over the protests. The other night when he had said, on Thursday night, I was on the Hiawatha Bridge, which is overlooking the third precinct and sort of the epicenter, the intersection. And that tweet came across when he quoted the sheriff from the South in the late 60s saying, if they're looting, you're shooting, or if you're looting, we're shooting. And I would say that looms over the protest, and there is definitely there's a genuine effort to try to dispel that and explicitly target that rhetoric from the president. But then I'll also bring it back to the local context here is that the head of the police union, the Minneapolis Federation of Police Officers, which is an incredibly powerful force in preventing the police department from being reformed here, is a man named Bob Kroll. And Bob Kroll laid out the red carpet when Trump traveled here earlier in the winter. He started a Cops for Trump t-shirt fundraiser, spoke at the rally, talked about how he was so happy that Donald Trump was finally letting cops do their job and punish criminals. And Bob Kroll has legitimate ties to white power bike gangs. He's called Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization. Has a laundry list of excessive force complaints, and he's really bred a culture of total corruption, racism, and his officers have really been seen going rogue. So I think people in Minneapolis see Bob Kroll and his police force as an extension of the kind of thuggery that we see coming from Donald Trump.
That's alarming. I also read today that Trump is encouraging governors to change laws so that protesters can be thrown in jail for 10 years or more. I don't know if you saw that, but how?
No.
Yeah. So he's really trying to use this to radically change and suppress protests in America.
Yeah. It makes me
His
think,
attitude was kind of like, that'll scare them. They're not going to be out on the streets anymore after that. What do you think, Eamon? Is he right?
That's a good question. I don't, from what I can tell from talking to people on the streets, there is not, for at least a good core of the protest base, which is primarily made up of Black youth, brown youth, and their white allies. But when I say youth, I do want to emphasize that a lot of the people in this protest that I've seen anecdotally are very young, probably under 25.
How old would you say they are?
I would say
under
that
25?
I would say 16 to 25. A very
Generation Z.
Very, very young crowd. I mean, obviously there's people, I'm 28, and there's people in my generation and other generations spread out throughout the protests. But if there's going to be kind of credit to the militancy, it definitely should go to the Black youth on the front lines. And I would say that I'm not sure if any kind of carceral threat will stop them. I can't speak for them,
Really?
but people that I've spoken to were under the impression that the National Guard was coming and were potentially going to use live fire. So, I don't want to speak out of turn and say what anyone is thinking, but my impression is that a lot of these people are not going to be stopped by anything.
That's really fascinating. It's so interesting what you're saying about their ages, because that's similar, or maybe a bit older even than the demographic that has been behind Greta,
Oh,
mainly, more girls. But, so we're really, what are we seeing here? What are they saying? Like, what kinds of things are these young people saying about why they're doing what they're doing?
yeah. Well, I can tell you about a young woman from North Minneapolis named Alicia that I met at a occupation at the Hennepin County Mike Freeman's house on Friday morning. Mike Freeman is son of the former governor of Minnesota, Orville Freeman. Mike Freeman has also run for governor. He's been Hennepin County attorney twice in his career. He has only charged one police officer for murder in his career, and it was a Somali black police officer who had killed a white woman in an upscale neighborhood just a few blocks from where he lived. And then when I was talking to this woman who's 23, she was talking about her formative years growing up, seeing Trayvon Martin get killed when she was in college, or she was in high school, and then seeing all of the rash of killings like you had listed in the opening quote from David Remnick. But then there was also two very high profile Black Lives Matter cases in the Twin Cities. In 2015, there was Jamar Clark, who was a 24-year-old black man who was killed by two Minneapolis police officers in North Minneapolis. That led to a 17-day occupation of the 4th Police Precinct. It was similar. I mean, this is almost like the sequel to that in a local context. And then in 2017, there was the death of Philando Castile, which was in Falcon Heights, which is a suburb just between Minneapolis and St. Paul. So, though it wasn't in the same jurisdiction as Mike Freeman, it was very much felt by the same communities, and it was the same. That time, the cop was charged, but he was found not guilty. So there's a very clear pattern of who gets justice under the law in Minnesota and in the Twin Cities. And when I was talking to this young woman and she was talking about, think about spending your formative years seeing that pattern. And then in 2017, you see the case with Justine Demond and Officer Mohammed Noor. And it is almost a Black Lives Matter case in the exact mirror image. And her death led to the firing
The
of the
one where the Somali officer was charged.
Yes. And so I think that there is just an incredibly stark clarity of fairness that young people aren't going to take. And, if you want to bring it back to Greta, I haven't heard people talk about this, but I think young people in general have a definite existential fear or sense of urgency or something in them that they know that this society needs to change much faster than the people in charge of it think it does.
That must scare the people in charge a lot. That's what I'm thinking after you say that. So, what was this last weekend like in Minneapolis? I mean, all over America, there was a lot of chaos. There were protests that were peaceful. There was looting. My mother lives in New York City, right by NYU, and she called me at about 11 o'clock last night because somebody had set a fire on the sidewalk right by her front door. And, what was really interesting about it too was that she, is in her building now relatively alone because so much of New York has already cleared out because of COVID.
Oh, sure.
The people who could get out, who could leave, lots of people left. So what we're really seeing is we're seeing on top of the COVID thing, now we're seeing civil unrest, which is not a big surprise, but it's pretty complicated. Like, how do you see that?
It is really complicated. And I've been learning to sort of be not immediately latch on to certain meta narratives quickly, and sort of having, I'm
Mm-hmm.
learning to deal with multiple things being true at once. And it's definitely, as a journalist, it's difficult to substantiate and really know, really sort out the facts in these moments. But I would say that it's absolutely true that these that this egregious display of racism in the case of the killing of George Floyd was, you know, sort of a straw that broke the camel's back for some people to get out in the streets, add on the COVID-19 pandemic and the total economic devastation and deprivation that the country is in right now, the level of unemployment, the people that can't pay rent, you know, the tax cuts that went
And
to the,
that's got to be hitting, well, it's hitting poor people the hardest, obviously.
yeah,
And we know that the COVID-19 statistics are showing that it's hit communities of color a lot harder.
yeah. And so I think that has to be factored into the looting and into you know, I've heard anecdotal evidence of people going straight for the useful household items first in the Target on Lake Street, not
Wow.
for the ones of value, for the most
Wow.
value. You know, that's just an anecdotal, but there are
Right.
definite material needs that people are being met, and or that people need to be met. And so, for instance, on Saturday I went to a Jamaican restaurant in South Minneapolis that had
It's open. Like you guys
no,
I
so
wanted to ask you that. Are you open back up? Like where are things?
no. Restaurants were open for takeout, and they had just opened their patios. And so I talked to
Okay.
the event manager at this Jamaican restaurant called Pimento Kitchen. They have a restaurant and a rum bar, and they're a music venue, kind of a hub for some of the local hip hop scene. And I talked to their events manager, this guy named Scott McDonald, and he had sort of overnight turned this restaurant into an ad hoc resource distribution center. First because I should say, it was him and his friend Malcolm Wells, another guy from Minneapolis, and they had said, you know, first they were in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, families were already hurting, and then on top of that, with some of the property damage to stores, looting of stores of household goods, they realized that there was going to be a lot of families in need in the Twin Cities. And so it was an incredibly impressive, inspiring setup, distributing out to schools in South and North Minneapolis. And you know, one thing that Scott told me that I thought was very poignant was, he said that you know, as a Black man in America, I'm having a war waged against me, and I understand the need I understand the need for unrest, and I understand why people need to burn it down, but there's collateral damage in war, and so I'm here to help limit that collateral damage that happens. And I thought that that was a very nuanced, sort of sober assessment of this, is that this is a reaction to one murder, but it's also a reaction to hundreds of years of you know, unjust treatment and racism of Black people in America. And so that was sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
That's
Um,
okay, because I have a question for you. Um, a little full disclosure here, just for those of you that know me, I've known Eamon for since he was very young, because of my relationship with your mother, who I really love, Marion Moore. And Marion told me Saturday night, she shared with me the neighborhood advisory that was being sent out to people in your neighborhood. And I read it, and it looked really pretty scary to receive that kind of warning. It was basically, it used the term, what scared me, what would scare me about it was the use of the term urban warfare. It talked about how there were going to be troops out, there were going to be troops basically in the sky, on the ground, and you wouldn't be able to see them all. Some of them would be invisible. So if you cannot go out on the street, because if you go out on the street, They will not know why you were there. And you might be, there will be, I think they used the term, there was lethal force in it too. So what was that like for you guys?
Yeah.
You know, just house by house to receive this kind of message and to just be suddenly in the middle of this.
Yeah. I mean, it was a sort of gradual escalation of so when I was saying on early Saturday morning when Governor Tim Walz said he was dispatching the National Guard, and then there was also word that the military police were basically on speed dial. He had also said that, and this is important to note in sort of talking about this meta narrative of the protests, is that he had now said the protests are no longer dominated by angry people in Minneapolis. It is now being hijacked by outside instigators. And
Was that true at that stage?
that's hard. That's one of those things that's difficult to say. There were outside agitators for sure, but there was also people from Minneapolis. You know, people don't want that to be a way to dismiss the real anger amongst the people of Minneapolis, even if there were people that then took advantage of that to come in and cause some extra property damage. But in addition to that, he had said that there were as many as 10,000 white supremacists traveling to the Twin Cities. And essentially what we were set up for was that
That would be scary.
we were now going to be a battlefield of urban warfare between white supremacists and the National Guard. And like I said, it's difficult as a reporter to really substantiate any of these numbers.
Did you see evidence there were some white supremacists there?
There were some. As I said, the restaurant that I was at, Pimento, they had received what they thought to be a credible threat.
Yeah.
They never were attacked. I'm hearing today that Councilman member Jeremiah Ellison, son of our Attorney General Keith Ellison, who just took over the case from Mike Freeman. Jeremiah is saying he's the council member of a district in North Minneapolis, and he was saying that there were confirmed white supremacists trying to set fires in North Minneapolis. But I want to end with saying those block organizations and neighbors meeting together, neighbors meeting together to make safety patrols, to make community fire patrols, because for a lot of the time the fire engines weren't coming out. They felt that their safety was compromised, and essentially the city services had given out for a couple nights.
Wow, that's a real breakdown.
And so what ended up happening with this growing unrest, and then with this warning of a possible outbreak of guerrilla warfare on our streets, is that people across Minneapolis did something that they hadn't done before, which was talk to their neighbors and really, really start to form neighborhood alternatives to safety beyond policing, which is the same exact thing that all of our groups, our criminal justice groups in the Twin Cities, like Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective and MPD 150, have been requesting since at least 2015, is that we don't need to keep investing in the solutions for policing to keep us safe. We need to invest in community-centered safety solutions. And I think the combination of the police repression and just outright brutality, there was medics that were fired on. As I said, journalists were fired on. There's an independent journalist who is now blind in one eye after being hit by a marking round. And so I think that, combined with residents starting to learn that by working in community, that they can actually start to patrol some of their own neighborhoods, I think that's at least maybe laying the blueprint for what policing could look like in America and in Minneapolis on the other side of this.
That's really helpful context, because I'm starting to hear people talking about in Canada to defund the police. It's a perplexing phrase if you don't have any context. But I think you just gave it quite well. So the alternative to pouring more money into police departments then is to pour money into communities and help them police their own. But
Yeah.
what's the difference between that and vigilante action? You know what I mean? Like there's kind of
Yeah.
the old thing of like from the old South actually, where
Yeah.
the groups of white men would go around and say, well, we're going to take the law into our own hands and we're now the authorities. And that was never a good thing.
Right. Well, that's essentially what the police grew out of is those slave patrols. So I think what people,
really,
yeah, American policing. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what people outside of an American context, maybe, and even within an American context, need to realize about policing in America is not, it's that it's all of the social services and civic services that police have been asked to do within the last 40 years, the role that they've taken on in society, the social problems that we then outsource to the criminal justice system. That is, we have
domestic violence,
mental health,
taking care of mentally ill people on the street.
Yeah. And then when you want to get down to even to things like crime, a lot of activists would point to economic sources of that. So really when people talk about police defunding and police abolition, and I'm no expert by any means, but what they're really talking about is getting to the root cause of crime and the human necessity for safety, and thinking of how they can do that more productively and and I think in a more democratic and less brutal and at times outright fascistic, as we see in the way that Black Americans are treated in America. I don't know if that answers the question on sort of.
It absolutely does. It's a great answer. It's a great answer. And I know you've done a lot of thinking and I believe some work to do with slavery in America and some tie-ins.
Yeah, a bit. Yep.
Well, I'm not going to ask you here to give us a whole history of slavery in America in 3 sentences, but can you talk a little bit about how you see it? Because I know you've thought about it, how you see, when you look at what's going on right now, like, do those thoughts emerge for you about like, wow, this has been going on now for hundreds of years in America. Like what is where are we in history right now on that continuum? Where are we?
Yeah. That may be above my pay grade, but to get us
okay, I'll ask Cornell West.
But no, I think what I can say is that I do one of the things that I try to do in my journalism and writing is to historicize present social problems, because I feel like America is a uniquely ahistorical country that has very short memory of how systems come in place, and often have simplistic notions of history and very whitewashed ones as well. And I will say that Minneapolis, especially South Minneapolis, where the epicenter of the protest took place, is an incredibly interesting place to learn about the real history of America, because we have a rich history of indigenous people, Dakota and Ojibwe, who formed the American Indian movement there in 1968, which was a radical militant Native American activist group that started out patrolling their community, protecting themselves from police violence, just as they were doing this weekend, I should add. They were they were actually someone who did catch some outside agitators, some young kids from Wisconsin. They actually treated them better than they said the cops ever treated them, sent them back on their way. But then I will also add that Minneapolis and northern cities are, they were receiving places for Black people from the South during the Great Migration, who were fleeing the Jim Crow South, which they were fleeing violence and coming to industry in the North. And so our cities are very much, northern cities in America wouldn't look the way they do without that historic migration of Black people from the South, fleeing that Jim Crow system that then grew out of slavery. Some of those policing models that grew out of it. It's always, it can be a little bit reductive to try to make kind of one-to-one historical comparisons, but the residue of American racism will always be there until we really get to the bottom of it.
Wow, what is the bottom of it? Like, how do we get there? Where is it?
What I've been seeing now, I mean, that's also, a $1 million question, but what I've been seeing on the streets mostly, I don't want to paint it as a totally kumbaya rainbow coalition, everyone's getting along protest. It's chaotic. There's divisions. There's people contesting for leadership and narratives. But what I would say is that there's also a tremendous amount of multi-racial, multi-generational, multi-gender solidarity between people. There was a speaker at one of the protests on Saturday. I didn't get his name, but he was on a megaphone. We were outside the 5th precinct, so that is west down Lake Street from the 3rd precinct, a couple miles. Down Lake Street where a lot of the looting and fires had happened. And he was saying, he said, the system's got my, excuse me, can I swear at all?
Yeah.
He said the system's got
it's
my
okay.
black ass down. He said the system's got my black ass down, but it's got a lot of you white people down too. And you other people, they call you illegal. You do all the work. It's got you down too. They hate me because I love you, and they hate you because you love me. And it's that sort of building of solidarity, which is not an easy process. It's easier said than done. It's going to take a lot of work and organizing and years and education and effort, especially on the part of well-off white people. But it is, I think that is really the only way.
Eamon, in terms of how things are unfolding in Minneapolis, where do you see things going from here, like over the next week? What's happening today, and what are you expecting?
Well, I'm really not sure. It's really hard to forecast. Things have appeared to calm down a little bit. I think when you call in thousands of soldiers into your city, things could calm down a little bit, and then tell other people that 10,000 white supremacists are ready to invade. I think that's got some people out of the streets. I will say that there was a protest last night of thousands of people that overtook one of the major thoroughfares, or I should say interstates, that was then closed off because of the curfews we've been having. The governor's been closing off the highways. There was an oil tanker that got on the highway and then attempted to drive through the protesters. So there was it's definitely not calm yet. And I keep reminding myself that this is going to be a marathon that will be a while. I thought that coronavirus would kind of define our summer here, but now it looks like coronavirus and the ongoing or aftermath of this uprising will define, the rest of Minneapolis. I truly do feel like the trajectory of the city has been fundamentally changed in the last week, to the point where if you weren't ready to examine some of the inequality and how maybe people in the city didn't have the same kind of confidence or respect for institutions as you did, for good reason, you really had no choice to but see that now because your life was totally upended by it, to like an actual kind of civic duty. So I don't, yeah, it's hard to tell, but yeah, I would say America's
So there's a lot of optimism.
yeah, I mean, there's always, I mean, you've always got to find that silver lining, but yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, they wanted to have something that kind of got the point across, and I think for a lot of people, the same peaceful protest was becoming ineffective, and they wanted to escalate their tactics. And now our city council president didn't say defund the police, but she tweeted, "We need more than incremental reforms. We need to radically reimagine our investments." So she's at least thinking about it. And this is a city council that was elected on police reform, but then kept raising their budget because they're also a council that's committed to real estate development, and you need cops to protect your luxury condos. So that's just kind of how it works. But at least they're now questioning it. So we'll see.
Okay.
All right. Well, yeah. Let me know if you need any.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Eamon.
All right.
Okay. Bye.
See you again.